Greetings, everyone, and welcome to this bonus episode of the Higher Ed Geek Podcast, episode number 121, with Amrit Ahluwalia from the Evolution, which is an online newspaper, part of the Modern Campus family. So this is focusing on their recent publication of a annual State of Continuing Education report. There's a lot of great information in it. We go over some highlights, but please do go check out the full report linked in the show notes. And we talk about just other general kind of current events and issues facing continuing education, and just a lot of great resources and things to check out if you're interested or work in this space. So do go check out the show notes and connect with Amrit to keep the conversation going. So appreciate everybody for listening. And without further ado, this is episode number 121, a bonus episode with Amrit Ahluwalia. All right, we are here talking about a recent report focusing on continuing education, which is something that I've just become a lot more acquainted with recently because I went through a wonderful esports management program at the University of California, Irvine that was through their division of continuing education. So this report stuck out to me to talk through, and I'm so glad that we have the opportunity to do that here on the podcast. But we'll start out as we always do. If you want to introduce yourself and give a brief overview of your professional journey of how you got to be where you are today.
Sure. And Dustin, thank you so much for inviting me to join you today. My name is Amrit Ahluwalia. I am the editor-in-chief of The Evolution. The Evolution is an online newspaper focused on non-traditional higher education and sort of the transforming higher ed marketplace. We were founded by Destiny Solutions, now Modern Campus, in 2012, basically to shine a light on how the post-secondary space is changing and how it needs to adapt to the needs and expectations of an emerging student demographic. You know, we live in a higher ed world that's fundamentally different than it was certainly when we launched 10 years ago, and definitely different than it was in the 1950s, which is in some ways what our education system is still designed to serve. So what we wanted to do was kind of normalize that new way of thinking about education, not just around who the modern student is, but also around, how institutions need to operate differently. In terms of my own personal journey, this has been my career. I came into my professional space launching The Evolution. And it's something that affects me personally just because of my mom. When she immigrated, so she immigrated from India to Canada to marry my dad in 1985. She had a bachelor's in chemistry from the University of Mumbai, and then decided to see the world. So in that sort of 2-year span between finishing her degree and settling down, she became a stewardess for British Airways. Now, when she came to Canada, she went to I guess our version of a work center and said, "Look, like I have a bachelor's in chemistry. I love math. I have a huge amount of customer service experience. What can I do?" And they said, "Well, cool, you were a stewardess, so you could probably work at a diner." And she felt that wasn't appropriate or something that she wanted to do. So she went back to school and she took her accountancy degrees. She became a registered CPA and joined the federal government as an auditor, and that was her 30-year career. And I remember, as a child, when she graduated that program, she didn't walk across the stage. We went to Smuggler's Notch in Vermont. And that's, very much been a part of my life, is watching her kind of persevere through really interesting and unique educational programs as an adult. So to have the opportunity in my professional life to give some space to adults who are just looking to transform their lives, to provide their families a new platform for something greater, it's really been one of my great privileges to be able to do this work.
That's great. I mean, I just appreciate you sharing that personal anecdote that makes this so much more kind of resonant in terms of the kind of compelling reason that you are kind of inspired to commit to this work and explore all these topics, and certainly play a part in this report, which I want to make sure we just kind of get right into because there's so much good stuff in here. So it's a report focusing on continuing education and the modern learner engagement gap. And I think it was informed by a survey that you all did. But if you just want to quickly kind of explain the report as a whole briefly, we'll be linking out to it. So please do, everybody, go check out the report yourselves. But if you just kind of want to give a high level overview of it, and just like how the report kind of came to be in terms of like identifying, I guess, like the need and then like facilitating it and all that.
Yeah, well, I'll start with how it came to be, and we're going to get into some of the key takeaways later in our conversation. So I certainly don't want to give away too much, but I'll tell you where this report came from is a fundamental lack of data around this unbelievably important part of the higher ed ecosystem. We talk about it anecdotally. We all have a general sense of what's happening in continuing education, but because of the diversity in the space, because of the range that separates different institutions serving different kinds of students with different missions, it's very difficult to have a single set of guidelines or benchmarks or standards around what folks are thinking. Now, our publication is squarely focused on what folks are thinking in the higher ed space, so we felt it very natural to stand at this kind of vanguard of helping to explain what's happening in this sector of the higher ed space. So that's where we came from. We published our first State of Continuing Ed last year. So this is the second edition of this study. And basically what we wanted to do was put some numbers behind the broad trends and the broad themes that we see in publishing this content on a daily basis. We have a lot of, again, anecdotal insights into things that are happening, but with this report, we have the capacity to really put some numbers behind it and to frame out the broader trends with a little bit more certainty and a little bit more clarity. And as far as what's in the report, that's really what it is. We've identified some opportunities for growth, which again we'll get into. We've identified some gaps, and I think what the report's really done, as you've mentioned, is it frames out an engagement gap that's starting to emerge, or frankly that has been slowly emerging for the better part of a decade. That's really come to a fore in the last 12 months between what a modern learner, regardless of age, expects from their college or university experience and what we, the institution, are delivering to address those expectations.
Yeah, I just found it, it was very comprehensive and very just intriguing. I think the perspectives that you're getting, that we'll dig into, like just for, I don't know, just fascinating to me. But I think just also some context for people, because I think, continuing education, I think a lot of what I was gleaming from the report that sort of solidified, what I imagine is the case at many institutions is that these sort of like offshoot arms of like the core university that are branded as the university, but just sort of, I don't know, they're kind of like, the metaphor my brain wants to say is kind of this like black sheep. Like there's sort of like kind of, there's kind of an arm's length there, but they give good outcomes to the students that are going there because they're just highly focused. They are, typically quick, like certificates that a student can complete and those sort of things. So I guess just like maybe even give that context of just, sort of the typical, division of continuing education at a university and how that typically is sort of like stood up and sort of, because I know that kind of is really important context for the kind of conversation in the report.
Yeah, no, it is super, super important. We need to know more about continuing education. I really appreciate you asking. So basically a continuing ed division tends to be a self-supporting arm or a college or university that, to your point, sits kind of on the periphery of the organization. It's designed to serve the students who aren't served by the main campus. Right. So that's fundamentally the point. It extends access to education into the community. It provides opportunities for folks to get short-term upskilling and reskilling. It provides professional development opportunities. It provides personal engagement opportunities. But let's take a step beyond that. Continuing ed divisions tend to manage the entire campus during the summertime and Christmas. So these units often wind up running camp programs for the K-12 audiences. They do the sports camps and the science camps and all those things that bring kids onto campus. They tend to do enrichment programming for senior citizens. So all these stuff, they'll manage trips to Italy, again at some point. So that's what the continuing ed does is basically everything else. And it kind of gets to the root of this question of, well, why is it so challenging to come up with some standardized data on the continuing ed space? Because any given continuing ed division can be doing all that and degree programming for audiences that aren't necessarily served by the Monday to Friday 9 to 5 on-premise programming offered by the main campus. These are the divisions that tend to innovate. They tend to be really on the forefront of what's coming next for higher ed. And again, I promise we will get into some of that because we did identify a few of those areas in the report. But online education came out of continuing ed units. Certificate programming in general came out of continuing ed units. So these are the divisions that tend to be on the forefront of what's next, which, by the way, is another reason why this report is pretty important, because in order for higher ed leaders to have a clear sense of where the industry is and where it's going, it's a good idea to keep an eye on what's happening in continuing education.
Uh-huh. Well, and I think too, like something that I'm like just reflecting on my experience. Like it's one of those things too, where like there's just all these different kind of names for these things, which maybe like kind of throw people off.
Yeah.
I know, like I think I've experienced like a school of professional advancement and like extension school and the division of continuing education, those sort of things. So there's a very broad scope of probably larger than people might imagine that falls into this sort of world that we're talking about here. But I mean, it is just an idea because it almost makes me think and I imagine some maybe have kind of merged in this way, like it's almost similar to like community colleges that end up, being really kind of dynamic and responsive to the needs of, and again, it's just this whole thing that we're still obviously like chipping away at the residue of like the traditional student and the non-traditional student. It's like, obviously the new normal is the adult learner and the person who's coming back who maybe already has some sort of credential. They need some retraining or some specialized training and those sort of things. But yeah, I mean, they're just doing the good work that any higher ed professional would say is, time well spent and they're producing really great outcomes and everything. But so I mean, this is kind of the crux of it, and it's probably going to be the teaser that hopefully, if anybody's on the fence for whatever reason, may compel them to read more into the report to get all the details. But just for you, like, what are some of the key takeaways from your perspective from this report?
Yeah, again, I think the key takeaway for me was that we're able to identify some of the roots of an engagement gap that's emerging between learners and the institutions that are serving them. And from the report, I think we've identified some interesting stuff. So again, we identified this broad recognition for the value of alternative approaches to higher education. And bear in mind, the respondents to this survey are Evolution subscribers from higher ed institutions, but it's not necessarily only continuing ed leaders. We had folks responding to this survey who sat in senior executive offices of colleges and universities. We had faculty members responding. So it's really a more diverse picture of folks that are looking at the higher ed space from a range of different seats. So we had 79% of respondents say that their institution plans to add or grow stackable credentialing. We had 74% of respondents say that their institution plans to add or grow to their portfolio of micro-credentials, right? So already we're starting to see this emerging space of how do we think about the academic product in a different way, right? We had 80% of respondents say that they plan to find ways to offer pathways from non-degree to degree-bearing programs. So suddenly kind of the primacy of the traditional academic experience is starting to give way to a recognition that folks learn in different ways and take different pathways to get to these kinds of broader outcomes. We also, interestingly, 76% of respondents said that they have senior leadership support to scale and grow non-degree education, which is amazing. But the thing is, there's this lack of practical support for non-degree programming outside of mission statements and strategic plans that's starting to hold back this shift, that capacity to capture the opportunities that we're highlighting. When we asked folks about obstacles to growth, they really could be mostly solved by more actionable support from senior leadership and from the main campus. I mean, things as simple as faculty members still being concerned about enrollment cannibalization, when ultimately, enrollment cannibalization is a misnomer on its face, because what you're saying is that you would rather folks not enroll at all than enroll in a program that's kind of designed more around their needs, more around the modalities that they're looking for, the credentials that they want to access. So I'd say the key takeaway to that point is that this engagement gap is really starting to emerge between higher ed institutions and the students they're meant to be serving. Learners today have unbelievably high expectations for their experience, both inside and outside the classroom. But colleges just aren't adapting to meet those needs and expectations. And CE divisions, fundamentally, this came out in the report, CE divisions are not resourced to deliver on those expectations. We asked the simplest question we could think of, and sorry, maybe I'm not framing that correctly, but we asked leaders if they could access the easiest piece of data that we could think of, right? How many students are you enrolling? So we asked them, how easy is it for you to access enrollment data for non-degree students? And we had 30% of leaders say that they have to ask, either multiple people for that information, or they simply can't get it, period. Right? I cannot think of an easier thing for a business leader to be able to figure out than how many customers you have. Right? Nearly 60% of respondents said that they can only deliver the experience non-degree students expect with significant manual staff effort. 74% of respondents said that their website should be driving student engagement, but only 10% that their websites were actually 10% said their websites were actually effective at sort of driving retention, driving enrollment, driving registrations. So you see this divide between, well, we know we need to be doing these certain things to engage the students that we're serving, but we're really not set up to do it. And I think all of this is linked. There's this broad vision, this broad support for the work that continuing ed could be doing or should be doing, but we're not resourcing them to do it.
Yeah. Well, and I think it makes me think of and many higher professionals will, this will likely resonate with them of they're going to get the job done, even if they're kind of rubbing two sticks together kind of thing. They care very much about their students and supporting them in any way that they can. And it's almost like this vicious cycle of you were able to do it. Yeah. With all these manual processes and everything. And it's why do we have to pay to have a modern, CRM or something, to keep logs of students and, who we have and who's on leave or, any of those sort of things. That is really the unfortunate thing is I think some people may be presumptive that it's I assume, there's an easy way to do this. But then if you're actually put the task to do it, it's wow, actually, yeah, I do need to ask a bunch of people, wait for them to reply, or maybe it's in sort of a non-user friendly way. You're just going to kind of get a raw data dump of something out of a, maybe a student information system. But it's the idea of there does have to be that core recognition, this work is important. We want to invest in, the proper tools and platforms to be able to do this in the most efficient way. And, just the idea of working smarter, not harder.
100%. I'll tell you what, I'm sorry. This is something that really fires me up because this is for 10 years. We've been observing this problem anecdotally, right? That's our publication has again and again and again been focused on telling stories of leaders who are doing these phenomenal things, serving their students in unbelievable ways. We talked about how complex and diverse continuing education is, right? But at its core, continuing education, whether you're at the most elite tier 1 R1 university you can think of, or whether you're at the local community college, continuing education is fundamentally student-centric. Right? Continuing education divisions, leaders, staff, faculty are squarely focused on how to get the student what they need, right? But the institution kind of doesn't tend to resource these divisions to do that. You mentioned the SIS, right? Now, we published an interview some years ago with the leader of continuing education at a state university in the Midwest. And this individual, we were talking about barriers to innovation. And she said, look, fundamentally, one of the biggest barriers to innovation is technology, because one of the cost-benefit analysis that they have to do when launching a program that they know is going to serve their students is it worth having our staff enter data multiple times in multiple different ways in order to run this course or program that's slightly outside the semester calendar, right? You mentioned the SIS. There are continuing ed specific SISs that would allow them to not even have this problem in the first place, right? To not even have that as a consideration. But when you're sitting there saying, here's a program or an offering or a course or a certificate that's going to benefit my community, but I have to think about my staff's well-being when I'm deciding whether or not to offer it. Well, that you're talking about the mission. right? What's our purpose as a continuing ed division? And that starts to, it really bothers me, because at the end of the day, it's the institution deciding that they're not going to prioritize doing the right thing.
Yeah, I mean, and I've just had that experience for sure of it almost kind of getting contentious, and it's like, well, we shouldn't have to be having this conversation in the first place about it being like, oh, it's going to be so much more work and that sort of thing. But I mean, yeah, I mean, it's clearly on the minds of people, because I feel like that's part of what's kind of boiling to the top through this report. And I kind of want to like jump ahead, because I feel like we're covering some of the stuff I wanted to mention, but I feel like we're right on the precipice of like talking through the, of the idea of like, consolidating that buy-in and, making the recommended changes around the, the tools and the platforms, and, any of those more, the more resources need to be given in this space. So like, just from your perspective, like what advice would you give to professionals trying to consolidate that buy-in? Because I'm sure you might just have to, go about it in a couple of different ways, but just whatever you'd want to share, I guess that might be relevant here in terms of that advice.
Yeah, this is something I've been thinking about. This is something I've been cooking on for frankly, I mean, I know we were planning this interview, but this is something I've been cooking on for, you know, charitably a few weeks, but realistically a couple of years, right? Because continuing education's slow move from the periphery of the institution to the core of the institution is something that I believe to be fundamental and central to the future of our industry. Right, like doing this effectively and doing it in a way that benefits students, still keeps students at the center, but allows institutions, employers, and learners to kind of all get what they need from one another, requires continuing education to be a strategic sort of imperative for the institution. It requires continuing education to be front and center of the future institution. So I'd say, what's the first action item? Honestly, meaningfully engage with your colleagues in continuing education. Understand the work they do, understand how you can collaborate with them to more effectively serve your audiences. Because one of the things we tend to see, during hard times for higher ed in general, is internal competition for adult students. We see, more traditional faculties starting to roll out programming that's non-credit, designed for adults, but not really taking into account any of the best practices inside or outside the classroom when it comes to serving adults. It's more just a very short-term response to a problem that they're observing. So rather than collaborating with continuing education, figuring out a way to do it well, the unit will just launch something itself. And it creates this really challenging environment where all of a sudden you have two departments competing for the same person. Right? And if we want to get away from enrollment cannibalization, collaboration is a really good place to start. Secondly, and I'd say similarly, ensure your continuing ed divisions are actually resourced to serve their audiences. In the most basic terms, continuing ed units should have the technology they need to deliver the experience their students expect at scale, right? Because the thing is, a student enrolling in a continuing ed offering is not bringing the same expectations or life experiences to their enrollment decision, right? The barriers to exit are extremely low, right? It's not as though when they're leaving a continuing ed program or deciding not to enroll, they have to take transfer credit into account, for example, or they have to take into account, well, what if I took a course here, but I'm going to have to take it again there? This is an individual looking generally for a short-term engagement. So students enrolling in continuing ed offerings really are customers at their core, right? And they can enroll basically in any offering, whether it's a MOOC or a boot camp. So continuing ed divisions really need to be resourced to make sure that they can operate like e-commerce leaders. They need to be able to bring that same customer engagement, because their students are looking at the institution the same way they look at Amazon, or the same way they look at Grubhub or any of these other services. The CE division has to be able to offer an Amazon-like shopping experience. It has to offer this kind of like frictionlessness and personalization that's really going to engage students, because that's what a modern customer expects, right? They need to create these touch points to engage a lifelong learner, because again, that student isn't just going to automatically enroll for the next term or the next semester and sort of plod away at a degree. This is someone who's working, they're trying to raise a family, they're on a career path, and the institution really has to take a more proactive role to make sure that individual sees opportunities to continue their education, right? And here's the dirty little secret. These are not just the characteristics of non-traditional students, it's just that non-traditional students have the agency to walk away, right? Your traditional age students today grew up with Netflix, they grew up with Amazon, they grew up with Uber. Like these are the standard expectations. So when it comes to what role does the institution need to play in engaging their future prospects, frankly, they should take a page out of the book of continuing ed to understand what it takes to be customer centric. And then finally, I hinted at the lack of engagement in websites earlier. Higher ed leaders need to take a good, hard look at their website to figure out if it's actually doing the thing they want it to be doing. A lot of university websites are basically glorified brochures, and they have huge amounts of information, but it's all impossible to find, right? Whether you're a prospective student, whether you're a currently enrolled student, if you're a parent, if you're an alumni, even for staff, finding the stuff you need to find on a university website can be unbelievably challenging. So, we really need to look at, well, what's the purpose of the website? And if you look at, again, any business, that website, you land on it, it knows who you are, and it feeds you the right direction that you need to go. That's the direction higher education in general needs to go. And again, it really starts with continuing ed because it starts with student centricity. So at its core, these kind of recommendations all come down to the idea of like, what's your strategic plan? And does your strategic plan position your institution to become truly student centric? And if it does, what are you doing to resource the changes you need to make to be student centric? Because without resources, a strategic plan's like a list. It's a Santa list. It doesn't mean anything. Like it has to come with action.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, yeah, I think incredible advice that you're sharing. And I think, because that's almost like a fun exercise is having people be like, hey, why don't you go and try to register for one of our courses and see like how long it takes you, or if you get, kind of like turned around. Like, why don't you go through our website and try to find blank or something, like little scavenger hunt, and let's see if people are like, okay, I got frustrated and gave up, or it took me like, cause I guess I was like, how about you guess how long it's going to take you to find this piece of information, then see how long it actually takes you. And you're like, wow, okay, we need to like, just reconfigure the website and all that. It's like, it does take some work, but it's absolutely time well spent to make sure that, again, obviously, the user, the end user, the student is not getting turned around or giving up themselves because they earnestly want to enroll in this course or those sort of things. And I know I can speak to my own experience going through this recently that like I followed through and taking all 4 courses for the certificate because it was super easy to register and like get everything done and all that. So, you just have to like address those friction points. And then certainly like the idea of identifying specifically like the tools and platforms and things that you might need to do your work if you're a professional that's working into continuing education. I know like it's just been swirling and coming up in a few conversations is like you're saying like, hey, we could really use this tool and this is why, here's the cost, and actually it's going to be like something that benefits all of our students. So really, if you cut that annual cost by the thousands of students that we support, it's kind of like dollars per student. And if we retain a couple more students because we're able to support them better, then, it kind of is sort of paying for itself or something, like you have to kind of like calculate those equations and really make that kind of compelling case for things. And again, that idea of like tracking where it's saying like, hey, actually, we've increased our enrollment by this much since we started using this tool, or like we've surveyed students to say like their satisfaction with our level of service has gone up since we allowed for them to be, doing these processes through like self-service and not waiting on, manual, responses and that sort of thing. So, I mean, I think this is all like the right things for people to be thinking about and talking about. And, even just that idea, like what you were saying of like kind of senior executive leaders kind of coming to the table and just like information gathering, like come as just the person who's like, I want to learn more. Like, don't be presumptive and prescriptive without really, coming and just humbling yourself before your continuing ed professionals and being like, how are things going? What do you need? And all that, because again, it's often this sort of like island offshoot that you might just be like, well, it's there, they're doing their own thing, they're fine or whatever. It's like, maybe they aren't talking to you because you're not like opening the door or like kind of pulling out a chair for them and being like, please come, I want to hear, tell me what's going on. Because I mean, just even in like our personal lives, it's like hard to be like, hey, I'm just going to like unload all my stuff on you. Like, I don't care if you want to hear it or not. It's like, it's so much more like, powerful when somebody's like, please, I want to know how truly are you doing, tell me everything and all that. Like they're just opening up their arms and sort of just letting that kind of come through and not kind of like, I don't know, forcing it or something.
Let me add on that, because the thing is, like you mentioned, a number of metrics, right, that you could look at to see where your ROI is in a technology purchase. And let me add another one, which is a little harder to calculate, but maybe a little easier to observe. And it's, how is your staff using their time? Right? If you're going to become a high touch, high tech environment, how are staff able to use their time and energy to engage your learners? Are they doing these manual, repeatable processes over and over again? Are they basically doing glorified data entry? Or are, to your point, right? You mentioned self-service. Are students able to do the basics of what they need to do so that when someone calls the office or when someone, sends an email, it's about something that actually requires human intervention and action. We saw, there's one school, we published a piece a few years ago. There was a school that they implemented a new system. They implemented a C specific SIS, and they saw enrollment go up. I think revenue grew something like 30% in 1 year, because not only did they have kind of the capacity to deliver the experience that students were looking for, but they also had the capacity to reframe the way that their staff members were using their time and effort to actually execute on outcomes that really were meaningful and impactful for the business. That was, uh, if you go to the evolution, look up Temple University and check out the piece that we did with them, because it kind of dives into how they leveraged this balance of sort of technology, strategic planning, and senior leadership support to really start to deliver these kind of high-end outcomes that really benefited everyone.
Yeah, that's powerful stuff. Yeah, I mean, and I love that you. It's one of my favorite kind of like turns of phrase of the high tech and high touch of yeah, the idea of technology sort of
Mm.
augmenting and not like replacing. It's augmenting and yeah, absolutely like allowing people, these hired professionals to support students who truly have something that's really like super unique. Of like, oh, I have these like transfer credits, and we've got to kind of vet them or do something else. It's like it's just something that requires a human being. And then there's all these other things that can be sort of automated and that sort of thing. And yeah, the idea of like, well, is it really that you want, these staff members to just be, yeah, like data entry specialists or whatever? It's like, well, then change the title, because that's, that's all they're doing, like, is that really what you want them spending their time on? Or do you want them like building rapport with the students and building community and like, tracking trend, like not entering the data, maybe like tracking the data and like, making some informed decisions and, problem solving and that sort of thing. So yeah, I mean, all just really great stuff. I appreciate you like sharing it and your enthusiasm for all this. It's just so great. And certainly, yeah, I mean, it segues right to like getting into the resources that we always love to share for each topic, like that blog post that you were mentioning from your all site. So anything else, I guess, from your kind of library of content that you'd want to make a note of, or just other like books, podcasts, articles, stuff that's like grabbing your attention that's relevant to this topic that we could share out?
I mean, I'll never turn down the opportunity to plug stuff. So I mean, obviously, visit the Evolution. It's evolution with 3ls.com. The 3Ls are for lifelong learning. It's really a treasure trove of content. We publish articles and interviews daily by folks talking about how higher education is changing and transforming. The work coming out of the Lumina Foundation right now, especially the Stronger Nation report that they publish, is really an amazing resource to get an honest and unbiased look at how we're progressing towards our attainment rate targets. And spoiler alert, it's not great, and really, I think that the difference can be made up, because we need to get to a 60% attainment rate by 2025. We are mighty close to that date, and we are pretty far away from that target. And in some states, it's looking kind of dire. So I'd really say that, check out the Lumina Foundation Stronger Nation report and get a sense of where your state is, because high quality certificates are a great pathway to improving the attainment rate, preparing people for middle skill jobs. On our website, again, on moderncampus.com, we address some of the concerns that we brought up around the engagement gap. If you go to our resource center, we have a white paper diving into the idea of what personalization and career pathways actually looks like in a post-secondary environment, and how to address that. So that's moderncampus.com, and then visit the resource center. I'd also really recommend getting engaged with some of the associations that advance continuing professional and adult education. In particular, the Evolution has relationships with 3 associations focused on this space. There's the Association for Continuing Higher Education, the Council for Adult and Experiential Learning. So that first one is ACHE. That's ACHE. The second one, CAEL or CALE, the Council for Adult and Experiential Learning. And then there's NCET, NCCET, which is the National Council for Continuing Education and Training. I mean, these three organizations are doing amazing work to bring together continuing ed leaders from across the US and Canada to help define some best practices and some collaborative efforts to transform the continuing and professional ed space. I would check out the work of those three organizations and consider a membership as sort of the first step towards closing that engagement gap.
Yeah, I always just love hearing about professional organizations I didn't know existed before. Just one for my own benefit, but also just like I just love that there are people out there that get to like nerd out and geek out about like professional education all the time, like and share that knowledge out and all of that. And I mean, I don't think it's like necessarily like wholly exclusive to like higher education and like at large, but just like the idea that like there's all these organizations, but just how much is sort of like people are just sharing their knowledge and kind of showing and telling and all this good stuff. So yeah, always great to know more about those organizations, and we'll link out to all of that and all the other stuff as well. But we'll close out as we always do. Just any final thoughts or calls to action on this topic that you'd like to end us out on?
Oh, that's a dangerous question, my friend. Okay, yeah. First and foremost, talk to your continuing ed colleagues. Don't make assumptions, as Dustin's rightly pointed out. Don't make assumptions about what they need or want. Actually, talk to them to get to the bottom of where their business is and where it needs to go. Download the State of Continuing Education survey. It is a piece that we're really proud of, but again, it's one of the very few data sources on where this industry is and where it's going. And finally, again, subscribe to the Evolution. So that's evolution with 3ls.com. We publish articles daily by higher ed leaders, really, again, talking about how the industry is changing, how institutions are adapting to keep pace. And it's a really good bellwether for getting a sense of where our industry is and where it's going. I'd say those are the three actions.
All good stuff. Yeah, I mean, just thank you so much for all that you've shared and the time that you've given us here. Definitely just a really important topic, and one that is increasingly kind of coming to the forefront of my mind, and especially so after reviewing this report. So thank you for working on it and sharing it out with the world, and all the work that you and your team continues to do here. So yeah, again, just thank you so much, and appreciate your time.
Absolutely. The pleasure's all mine, Dustin. Thanks again for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the podcast. Make sure to rate, review, and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode of the Higher Ed Geek podcast.